Okay, for those of you who walked in a little bit late, I am Professor Roberta Fulthorpe, and Professor Mitchell cannot be here today, so he asked me to substitute in and teach this lecture for him. Just by way of, so you know who I am, I was hired in '94 as the first biologist in the environmental science program, and since then we've added more people with more interdisciplinary skills. But anyway, it means that I'm quite familiar with this topic, but I'm a little blown away at the breadth of it. We're going to talk about systems, ecosystems, material, biogeochemical cycles. So, without further ado, the outline. We're going to talk about the definition of a system and how do they work. Of course, all systems work a little bit differently, but we'll talk about it in general terms. What do we mean by feedbacks and equilibrium? What do we mean by environmental systems? What is an ecosystem? What is ecology? And then we'll touch on the major geological and biogeochemical cycles on the planet. Now, I suspect that at least some of these concepts are not new to you. By show of hands, how many people have already heard of? Okay, great. A few. How many have heard of have had lectures on biogeochemical cycles? Not actually that many. Okay, let me back up a little bit too. I was going to ask this at the beginning. How many people here are actually in environmental science program? That's about 50%. And maybe, are there a bunch of people here from IDS? Cool. Anybody from straight biology? Right, that's what I expected. Anyone here from something different? Management, right? No? You're in management? Cool. What a mix. Okay, so I guess given that, I have to talk it kind of assuming you don't know anything. So I apologize for that. All right then. So first thing, what is a system? And Carl here has given me an example that typify most of his examples. I think he's a little focused on vehicles. There is a system is something where processes occur that can typically do work of some kind. And systems almost always have some form of input and some form of output. And then there is work in the middle or processes that go on. And the picture we're showing here is of an old-fashioned steam locomotive train. And can anyone tell me what the input is here? Did you say fuel? Coal, exactly. They used to shovel coal into the boiler system. And then the output, well, the point of that was to boil water to produce steam. And what was the point of producing the steam? You have to speak up a little bit. That's right, to drive the pistons to make the train actually move. And so the output would be not just the steam, but all the combustion products from the coal as well. We won't talk about whether or not this is an efficient system, but it was a revolutionary one. Now we have to distinguish between open systems and closed systems. And here is an example of an open system. Once again, a vehicle. Where we're talking about a more modern car here. And we have, again, inputs of energy and matter and outputs of energy and matter. That is what defines an open system. There's a whole bunch of stuff coming in, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going out. But in the middle, there are energy and matter conversions that go on, and hopefully some kind of work that needs to be done, in this case, locomotion again. And there can be, in a system, also energy and material storage. So not everything that comes in has to go out. Many systems will hang on to matter and energy and recycle matter to some extent. So it's really a continuum, the definition of open systems versus closed systems. You'll find that it's difficult to find a truly closed system in the world. So most systems that we talk about are somewhere between completely open and completely closed, where nothing goes in or out. Anyway, this example here of an open system, as I said, is a car. And just to cover off the details, the inputs here are, of course, fuel, gasoline or diesel, oxygen to burn that fuel, oil to keep the engine running smoothly, water to keep the engine cool, so it bleeds off some heat. The tires, of course, resources to make the actual body of the car and the engine itself, and payments. There's a great deal of money that goes into just acquiring those resources and putting them together. The outputs are all the exhaust gases, waste heat. All engines produce heat as a byproduct. Mechanical motion, although you could argue that's the process in the system. Waste oil, used tires, scrap metal, and other things. So that's a typical open system, actually very wasteful in terms of what it recycles, almost nothing in the middle. You throw in fuel, you burn it, you drive the pistons, you move along, and you exhaust all kinds of waste products. And a closed system is one where you have virtually no inputs and outputs, but you always have to have some kind of input and output. No system can operate in a vacuum or in the absence of some energy. So what we show here is the inputs, whereas in an open system, you have inputs of energy and matter. In a closed system, you typically only have energy coming in. And the outputs, similarly, you don't have energy and matter going out, you just have energy going out. And what happens in the middle here is different processes, some kind of work occurs, changes occur to the matter, and there's energy conversions. But there's a great deal of maintenance of the matter. And what is not shown in huge detail here, and should be if you're taking notes on those slides, I would see this little blue thing here. That is, of course, a recycling sign. And in my mind, it's not big enough. There should be a huge arrow that goes out from here and around and comes back, because that is the nature of a closed system. There is highly efficient use of all the matter, and it gets changed and changed again, but it stays in the system and it feeds the system, and so it is the ultimate in perfect recycling, a closed system. Now the example that Carl has shown here, I had to stare at for a little bit till I understood why I used this. This is a bomb calorimeter. Does anyone know what a bomb calorimeter is? You're great. You've been answering questions all the way along, but you don't know what this is, right? It's a little metal vessel that people typically use to measure the energy content of organic matter, say food, if they want to know how many calories there are in a tablespoon of peanut butter or something like that. They would put that matter into a closed vessel, which then can be combusted. So although it would be hard to burn peanut butter, but they typically put dry things in and they ignite them and have the calorimeter convert all the organic matter into energy, which is measured as heat. So in order to determine the calorific value of organic matter, they put them in this vessel, burn it, and measure the temperature change. That gives them an idea of how much energy is there. And it's all contained in this closed system, so therefore the temperature measurement should be fairly accurate, or a fairly accurate indication of how much energy was in that food. It's not completely closed because, of course, going into the system is a stir, and coming out of the system is a little bit of heat. But mostly it's all contained within. Now this is another mechanical example, but we are going to talk about ecosystems. So can any of you tell me an example of a closed ecosystem? Or even an open one. I'm going to have to pick on someone. Yeah, great. An island where organisms can't leave. That's a pretty good example. But there would be, this is what I'm saying, there's a continuum, right? So in an island, you're going to have perhaps birds fly in and fly out, maybe bats. And an island, there would be dependence on the coral reef and fishes around. So, but to a great extent, an island is a closed system, or a more closed system than others would be. Someone has their hand up here. Sorry? Someone shout that for me. I can't. A pond. Thank you. Depends on, yes, to a certain extent, but of course it has inputs of water coming in, unless it's what we call a kettle lake, which has no surface water coming in. But even a pond is going to have rainwater fall down, and coming with it would be nutrients, atmospheric pollutants and atmospheric nutrients. And again, any animals that come in and out would be part of that system. But you're on the right track, something that has sort of a delineation. But this is typical of what we call our ecosystems. We would like to think of them as being closed, but all of them have connections to something else nearby. So not all ecosystems are not completely closed, but it depends on their geographic location. Anyway, we'll carry on. Thank you, you guys. Right then, feedback loops. I'm almost positive, but let me just check. How many people here know the difference between a negative and a positive feedback loop? Oh, that's good. So then when I ask you for examples, you're going to be able to tell me. So a feedback loop is where the output of the system affects the input as it's changing. And there are, of course, two kinds of feedback loops. The negative feedback loop, or what I tend to think of as the sustainable one, where the system deviates from a certain state, and then the processes within that system make it come back to the same state again. So if a negative feedback loop does not let things does not let things change too much, whereas a positive feedback loop is the opposite, where as the system is changing, the processes change to exacerbate that change. So it's an escalating change in the system, which may take it completely out of the zone of sustainability. But there are examples of both in nature. Ah, yes, here is the classic example. And I have issues with this, but we'll get to that in a minute. So here's your classic predator-prey system. That was the first one that was ever recorded by scientists and led to the development of the Lotka-Volterra mathematical equations, differential equations, that promise to explain for us predator-prey cycles in nature. And it came actually not so much out of an independent system, but out of one in which humans were interacting with these creatures. Came from the records of the Hudson Bay Company, which of course is the company that came into Canada, or developed in Canada, and made its money exporting furs back to the old world. And because they kept a record of how many furs they had from both small creatures like these hares and the larger creatures, the lynx, they therefore had a record of exactly something correlated to the populations of these animals. And so what they noticed in looking through those records is that as the hare population increased over time, it would support more and more predators, the lynxes, because of course lynx love to eat hares. But as the lynx increased in population, they would deplete the hare population and then thereby starve themselves as well. So you would have an increase in hares followed by an increase in lynx, followed by a decrease in hares, followed by a decrease in lynx. And then the cycle would start all over again. As the lynx died out, the hares would pick up again, and they would track each other in this wave pattern, or this cyclical pattern of populations. That's considered a classic negative feedback loop, because as the hares go out of whack, or they increase in population, it's the population of lynx that's actually the negative feedback driver to bring them back down again. And hopefully what you end up with is a more or less stable population of both over decades that can continue into the future, provided that no one of the two species goes extinct. I just say I have issues with this because It is actually the only perfect example that we have of perfect cyclical populations where the two are in sync with each other, well, slightly out of sync in terms of time. But if you look at other predator-prey cycles in nature, you rarely find something as clean and as pure as this. And I think that the reason why this worked out so well is there was actually the third party involved. There was the humans who were hunting both these creatures and applying pressure to both their populations. So they would be in there making the system a little bit more simple than it would have been. Or at least their snapshot of it would be simple because they were just counting hair and lynx furs. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that. So that's one negative feedback example. Now, a lot of you told me you've already heard about this, so give me a second negative feedback example. In nature. Well, actually not even in a physical system, if you like. Yes?
Bodily function. So if, say for example, your hormones is low on one end, something else will pick up for it, or vice versa.
Right. Do you want to name one of those systems? And let me just repeat your answer to the class. You're sort of right. Her answer was bodily functions, where the systems, particularly in the endocrine system, the hormones will regulate your behavior or your metabolism such that you're always staying within a particular range. In other words, that's what we call homeostasis. And homeostasis is a classic set of negative feedback loops. I've just thought of one. Of course, the temperature regulation system. If we get too hot, we sweat, and that allows us to evaporate water, take heat away from our bodies. And if we get too cold, we'll shiver. That generates heat, and it tends to keep us within the zone of 37 degrees C, hopefully. And there's numerous examples of endocrine-driven systems, such as the sex hormone cycles, that go up and down and keep us within a certain stable range. Yes? Inflation is oh, you've got to explain that one to me. Why is that a negative feedback cycle? I'm lousy at economics.
Things get more expensive, so workers demand more money.
Yes.
Companies now have to raise their prices so that they can keep up with having to pay the workers more.
Yes.
So things are more expensive again.
Yes. That's a positive feedback cycle. Because, at least the way you've explained it.
Nobody goes on forever, so it's not like ice melting.
Right, okay. It goes on forever. Well, that's debatable. But the point is that it depends on what you're measuring. So, like, prices are not stable under that model. They keep going up and up and up. So, wages go up, prices go up, wages. So the system state is ever increasing, right? But that's debatable whether that's negative or positive. It's a good example. Someone else had their hand up over here earlier. No? Oh, there you are. Protein synthesis as a negative feedback cycle?
Depending on how far along in the chain, a certain amount of one protein
Yeah.
discourage the production of a previous protein in the chain.
Oh, I gotcha. Yeah, right. So there's feedback on the biochemical cycles where one inhibits. Well, I mean, you can get the protein will feed back on the gene expression. Is that what you mean? Yeah, exactly. So a lot of regulatory mechanisms in biochemistry are negative feedback cycles. Perfect. Thank you. Positive. And I know some of you already know this because you just alluded to it. Positive feedback cycles where the change accelerates the process that makes the change. And the example shown here is a solid surface of sea ice, which has a great deal of reflective capacity or albedo. And as the sunlight comes in and heat is generated, the glaciers begin to melt and the sea ice begins to melt. And as the sea ice melts, it tends to uncover the darker colored water underneath. And that, of course, absorbs, its reflectivity is heavily reduced. and there's more heat absorbed by the dark water than by the white ice. And that increases the rate of warming, which increases the rate of melting, which increases the rate of warming. So that is a classic positive feedback cycle that we find in nature, and one of the ones that's currently problematic for our stability on this planet. Like it says, any other ideas of examples of positive? Hello, yeah.
An example of positive feedback loop in like human bodily functions, like when a woman is giving birth and like her body continues to release oxytocin.
I hadn't thought of that one, but the answer was when a woman's giving birth, so during labor, the oxytocin is released, and that causes her to push more. Yeah, that's true. That is, but that's a temporary positive feedback cycle, because once the baby's out, then hopefully she stops producing it. Yeah. Does she stop producing oxytocin, or does that carry on?
Well, she produces it in like regular amounts from like regular.
Right. It's been a long time since I studied that stuff, so I'm not thinking of that. How about, geez, actually the melting ice is the best one. I was going to say, like an example from psychology or behavior would be when you're having a fight with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, and one of you calls one a name and the other one calls the other one a name, and then you end up in tears or fighting or whatever. That's classic positive feedback cycle. So there are examples of both out there, and we tend to think of the positive feedback cycles as being the bad ones because your system can be destabilized. Equilibrium. Equilibrium just means that the various things, the processes that you would measure within a system, stay more or less within the same zone. And here is an example of what we call steady state. It's actually not all that steady, but say, for instance, the level of populations that you measure, or the level, or the temperature, or the amount of rainfall or something stays more or less in the same area with a little bit of error year after year or month after month. Whereas a dynamic system is one that changes to a much greater degree. As you can tell, both of these are similar. We both have irregularities happening on a short time scale and over a long time scale. One tends to stay the same, and the other tends to change dramatically. And it's really a question of which piece of the curve that you want to look at if you define it as being dynamic or steady state. And of course, this difference confuses the whole climate change issue, because people like to think of our climate as being steady, and it is in the sense that if you look over the last few hundred years, the CO2 concentration's been more or less steady until the last couple of decades. But over geological time, it is highly dynamic, and things have changed a great deal. So you have to qualify how you name a system based on what time scale you're looking at. Right, emergent properties. This is an interesting one. Emergent properties are a characteristic of a system not evident, or something you can't see, from its individual components. And this should be sort of obvious. It means if you look at a forest, or even here we have depicted just a tree, if you look at the little bits that make up a tree or a forest, you're looking at small parts that don't tell you the whole story. So you would see branches and sticks and acorns and dead leaves, and you'd see bits of soil. But you wouldn't be able to perceive by looking at the individual components that that forest or that tree has properties that are extremely important to the things around it. So, and what they're showing here as an example is, I have to peer at this carefully, element of forest ecosystem. So the tree is part of a larger system. Most importantly, it is producing oxygen that feeds all the systems around it. And of course, it supports wildlife that use the forest as habitat and as sources of food. So the emergent properties are things that come out of those systems that are not evident from the individual bits. And it always amazes me, as it amazed me this morning, and it did yesterday too. I work in the SY building over on the other side of campus, and we're right close up to the forest there. And as small as that, I mean, it's not, there's a nice ravine there that drops off from our building and down towards Morningside. And of course it continues up and down the Highland Creek, but it's not a huge area. But year after year after year, that forest system continues to produce deer. It amazes me. The creatures as gorgeous as deer can just walk out of the forest. And that, like yesterday we saw one come out with 2 fawns, twins, that they can survive and that they can gather food and reproduce in such a small, isolated island in such an urban area. It just amazes me. But the growth of those animal populations is an emergent property of forest systems and therefore of trees. And of course, you wouldn't be able to tell that by looking at a piece of bark or just a handful of soil, that it would be able to produce such a complexity of life. Right. So environmental systems, we have already kind of named a few examples, but Professor Mitchell wants you to understand the concept of ecosystems, and he's going to get into hydrologic cycles, the global energy balance, and biogeochemical cycles. Now, as he indicates here, he's going to talk about hydrology in the next class and global energy balance. He says next class, I guess those two are coming together. But we will talk about biogeochemical cycles in this one, but there's a few more slides before that, I think. And of course, Professor Mitchell is a hydrologist. That's his area of expertise, that and mercury contamination. Right. This is review, I'm sure, but the Earth system, the ecosystems on the planet are made up of different subsets, although I don't really like this definition because it separates things from each other. But here they talk about atmosphere, lithosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, cryosphere, and the anthroposphere, as if they were 6 different worlds, 6 different systems. That's wrong. That's just patently wrong. You can use these words to refer to the different areas of study. So typically scientists may be experts in the study of the atmosphere and gas exchange and gas production and gas uptake. And our geologists, of course, are very fond of studying the lithosphere. What are the rocks? What names do we give to them? How do they form? How do the mountains get here? And biologists, of course, are all about that biosphere and what living things are, live there and how do they interact. Hydrologists, the water system. Cryosphere, those people who love to study glaciers and snow and the Antarctic. And the anthroposphere, well, they call it anthrosphere here, the world of humans, in which, of course, there's many, many, many different fields of study. But to imply that these 6 different things are separate systems is wrong. So just see them not as a definition of systems, but as just words that describe the components. Because a healthy, functioning planet has an atmosphere that interacts with its lithosphere, with its rocks, and certainly with the biosphere. And certainly, of course, the whole thing is driven by the presence of water. So these things are not separate systems, they're separate components. Ecosystems, the study of ecosystems says here a broader step up from community ecology. The community, these again are really just definitions. Community ecology really concerns itself with the interaction of populations. And that can be interacting populations of animals or interacting populations of animals with plants. But the study of ecosystems tends to be even broader than that. So rather than just looking at how the individual living things interact with each other, how they eat each other or kill each other or compete with each other. The study of ecosystems is the study of the thing as a system. The energy that goes in, where does it come from? The matter that goes in, the processes that take place within it, and that includes all the interactions between the living organisms and the abiotic things. So the components of soil, the gases, the water, the rocks, what gets dissolved, the movement of dead things and matter, and also what kind of energy goes out. So the study of the ecosystem is a study of living things and the abiotic world, of course. And in here we have like a simplistic diagram of how a forest ecosystem would work. And I'm not going to go into terrible detail there. You can see it for yourself. It's interesting. This must be taken from a North American textbook because this is a classic North American forest. We have a deer, which I've just mentioned. We do have here microbes in the soil, earthworms to keep organic matter turning over. Wait, say that again?
It says American code on the diagram.
American what? American toad, thank you. I knew that was a toad. You didn't have to tell me that. Bufo, is I think what they call it. That is either a hairy woodpecker or a pileated. But we have both of those in our ravine. I don't know what kind of snake that is. What does that say? Rat snake. We do have rat snakes. I had one of them come and visit me when I was doing my PhD research. That's worth telling you the story just for the fun of it, just to, I did my PhD research actually on the release of bacteria, really, really exciting animals, organisms, at the Queen's University Biology Station. And that is a lovely 200-acre place north of Kingston that's situated on a lake. And I used it to set up aquaria where I was introducing bacteria that had a particular kind of novel genes that could be used for the breakdown of pollutants. And I was introducing them into the wild to see if those genes would A, survive, or B, transfer. So that was my excuse to be a microbiologist, but also to be out there in the woods. So I had 12 tanks, and on top of those tanks I had a big wooden shelf that had pumps and things that were pumping different chemicals into the tanks. And I had a pipe down the bottom of the floor that took filtered water from the lake and put them into the tanks. And the field station is near Kingston, and Kingston is one of those places where the rat snake population is really high. It's very, very few places where they exist. But the rat snakes, and these creatures they look nasty. They're 6 feet long. They're black. And they pretend to rattle, but they don't actually have a rattle. And, but they're considered endangered. So the people at the field station were forever studying these creatures and kind of like to have them around. Well, I was sitting at my bench carefully plating out bacteria on a bunch of agar plates for the morning's work, and I heard this thump and this kind of strange noise. And I turned around and looked up on the shelf, and there was this 6-foot black rat snake weaving its way in between the pumps on top of the aquaria. And so I jumped up and ran down to the field station and said, "Come and get this snake." And, and they were like, yeah, we wanted, because they wanted to record every instance of seeing those snakes and to band them, find out which one they were. They had names for the individuals. And so they came up and they got her and they took her away. It was a female. And then not half an hour later, I'm sitting at the bench, I'm plating agar plates, and I hear a thump. I turn around, there's another damn snake going in between the pumps. It was a male that had smelled the female, and he was coming after her to visit her. So another run down to the field station, bring the snake back. It was an exciting day. I almost tried to pick one up once because I figured, I know they're not poisonous. I know the rattle is just a fake, but when they look at you, you don't want to touch them. Anyway, that was an aside. Suffice it to say, this is the little creatures they have depicted on here are familiar to those of us in this part of the world. And if you live in a healthy enough, self-sustaining ecosystem, you'll be able to see them. Right. official definition, all organisms and non-living entities that occur and interact in a particular area at the same time. That's the definition of an ecosystem. It includes abiotic and biotic components. It includes energy flows and matter cycles among these components. And matter recycling is the hallmark of ecosystems. Matter gets changed and processed and handed from creature to creature all the time. And generally, this is kind of vague, the smallest ecologically self-sufficient space. It is debatable about what you want to use the term ecosystem for. Because, as I said, the hallmark of these things is that matter recycles and they are sustainable. And the degree to which they are closed or open tells you just how self-sustainable they are. But generally, we talk about things that, systems that if you give them a source of energy and sufficient nutrients and water, they will just churn away on themselves and regenerate themselves for, in perpetuity. They'll also evolve, but they will continue to exist without any major input, save for the most important input, which is the first piece of energy, which in our case, in most of our cases, is sunlight. Let me just go ahead to see what the next slide is before I go backwards. Yeah, no, I'll leave this here. So the key to having an ecosystem and a self-sustaining ecosystem is to have the first energy source there that can drive it, that can drive the production of biomass. And then you have to have sufficient nutrients and water and space for the biomass to be traded between trophic levels to generate a system that basically is filled with negative feedback loops that can go on for a long time. So what is shown here is energy flowing through an ecosystem. Typically, where's my thing? Typically, we're talking about sunshine. So, of course, ultimate solar energy comes in and drives the growth of producers. What do we mean by producers? Of course, we mean those organisms that can take sunlight and turn it into biomass. They can carry out that magical process of photosynthesis, which produces sugars and carbohydrates and then proteins and cellulose and lignin from just a little bit of sunshine. They can be aquatic producers, they can be algae, or they can be terrestrial producers, they can be plants and trees. It doesn't matter. They can still support an ecosystem. And then after the producers, of course, this is like high school stuff. Primary consumers, organisms that will eat that primary plant biomass, herbivores or vegetarian humans or a whole bunch of insects. And feeding on them, the secondary consumers, those that will eat other animals and microbes, and then tertiary consumers. Depending on how complex the system is, you may have a whole chain of organisms that feed on each other. But it is not just a chain, of course. There's major feedback loops. All these organisms feed back down to the original system as they die, as they produce waste matter, and they return biomass to the soil, dead biomass. But it is quickly taken up by the microbes, bacteria and fungi that turn that stuff back into a suitable source for the producers to live on again. So all you really need to drive an ecosystem is somewhere to be, space, and you need sunshine, and you need enough DNA in the form of little organism packets to get a self-sustaining ecosystem going. Down here it just says matter, nutrient cycling within the system. Of course, all this movement of food between the organisms represents the matter cycles. And what you don't want to see is major export of all that matter going out of the system, because it will cease to exist, or at least it will become a different kind of system. Conversion of energy to biomass in ecosystems, principal source of energy. Let me just go forward again. Let's go back. As I just said, for the most part, the source of energy for an ecosystem is sunlight. But can someone tell me of an alternate source? Yes. Excellent. Yes. I didn't hear you, but I heard you say mid. Chemosynthesis. There are these amazing systems down in the bottom of the ocean, the hydrothermal vents, that are essentially nothing more than underground volcanoes. And that is the one major system in the world, natural system in the world, that doesn't need sunlight at all. They're way down deep. There is actually no sunlight penetrating down there. But the volcanic action, the gases and the hot water that's coming up is filled with what we call reduced inorganic substances. So it's chock full of sulfides and like iron sulfide and calcium sulfide and other reduced compounds that can actually be used as a source of energy by the bacteria that are capable. They don't need sunlight. All they need is the energy in these minerals. They oxidize the minerals with the oxygen in the seawater, and they produce biomass. And then there is a whole range of creatures, and I think some of them quite different between the hydrothermal vents, that live off of the bacterial biomass. So it's completely disconnected by sunlight, and each hydrothermal vent, they also call them black smokers, because the water that comes out is black from the minerals. They have their own little ecosystem. They have giant tube worms, they have big spiny looking crabs, they have weird looking shrimps. And people have just scratched the surface of understanding those. But that is an area, a system that you can call an isolated ecosystem, not entirely closed, because the energy is coming up from the subsurface, the deep subsurface, and the oxygen has to come in ultimately from our atmosphere. So it needs those inputs, but still it is as isolated an ecosystem as you're likely to find. Is there any other system that's not driven by sunshine? What about us? You could argue that a great deal of the human systems, although we don't actually eat oil, but we're getting close, you could argue that a lot of the human system is driven by fossil fuels, which are not sunshine, although they did originally derive from sunshine. Anyway. So, principal source of energy, generally sunlight, biomass, organic matter that makes up all living organisms. What's next? Oh, I didn't realize I had this in here. An autotroph is a word that should be self-explanatory. Auto means self, and troph means feeder. These are organisms that don't need the organic matter from another organism to survive. So these are the primary producers. And as it says here, an organism that produces complex organic compounds from sunlight and inorganic molecules. So all the plants in the world, all the algae in the world are autotrophs. And then some bacteria are what we call chemoautotrophs, where they derive their energy from minerals rather than sunlight. But they're both autotrophs. And all ecosystems depend on those autotrophs to survive. Gross primary production, that is the word that we give to the amount of biomass that's produced from the primary energy source. It says here sunlight, but it could be the chemical energy. So if you imagine you've got a bunch of plants standing side by side in a field, and the sun comes down and feeds them, they undergo photosynthesis, they produce sugars, they build those up into carbohydrates, they make other components of their cell. All of that stuff that gets made is called the gross primary productivity. But the plants have to breathe as well, and they have to derive energy from they have to derive more energy from the very compounds that they've made. So they have to produce ATP to run their biosynthetic processes, and to do that, they have to respire the very carbohydrates they've just made. So plants will make sugar, then they'll turn around and burn it so they can have energy to make other compounds in their tissues. So there is respiration, which is opposite from photosynthesis, but typically does not go over it. I mean, it uses less energy than the photosynthesis produces. And then what we get is a term we call net primary productivity, which really represents the amount of food that the ecosystem now has to live on, right? So the plant generously makes all this biomass, it burns up some of it for itself, but there's all this stuff left over, you know, in its tissues, in its reproductive tissues when they produce seeds. All that stuff is left over to drive the ecosystem and support the herbivores and the consumers. So net primary productivity is the ultimate important number when it comes to talk about how much life a system can support, and similarly how much life the whole planet can support, because we're all dependent on net primary productivity, unless we eat oil. And then there's something called net ecosystem productivity, which I find less useful a concept, but still it's the net primary productivity minus the heterotrophic respiration and the herbivory. So all the things that live on the plants, after they finish consuming and respiring themselves, there is a leftover, some production still that goes on to build structure within an ecosystem. So for instance, if you're thinking about a forest system or a tropical forest system, or even an agroforestry system, the stuff that's left over to actually make wood with and to make, you know, 3D structures out there would be part of the net ecosystem productivity. And I don't know. I'll just go over this one slide, and then we can break. This is a course review. Photosynthesis occurs in the presence of light and chlorophyll. And this is the simplistic equation that shows you that with carbon dioxide and water, and what's missing here is light, or the energy, you can produce C6H12O6, which is the general formula for carbohydrates. This is actually one sugar, but you put them all together, you get complex carbohydrates, and you produce oxygen. It's a simplistic equation because the real situation is so cool. There's two processes. There's the process whereby light comes into the chloroplasts in the plants and sets up an imbalance in protons and is able to drive the production of ATP. And you all know ATP is like the energy of life. So the light produces ATP, then the organism uses the ATP to drag the CO2 into the form of carbohydrates. And I deliberately talk about that as being in two pieces because in our chemoautotrophs, which also produce or support life, they don't use light to produce ATP, but they use the oxidation of minerals and then use the same process to drag the CO2, the Calvin-Benson cycle, into their tissues. I think there's one other part to this. Respiration, of course, is the opposite. You take a sugar, you burn it, literally burn it within the cell. It becomes oxidized into simpler and simpler compounds with the output being CO2 and more water, and the energy comes out again. So these are opposite and complementary processes, and in the big picture of things, the homeostasis, or the balance of the Earth's atmosphere, is kept in more or less a stable place because this photosynthetic process that produces oxygen and takes up CO2 is balanced ultimately by this that uses oxygen and produces CO2. Things do get out of whack, as I'm sure you're aware. All right, now it is 10:01, and I'm sure you'd like a break. So let's take a 10-minute break and come back. We'll talk a little bit more about net primary productivity. All right, welcome back. I'll put this back on slideshow, but for now I took it off because I realized Professor Mitchell has provided us with a couple of YouTube videos to illustrate the processes of positive net primary productivity and decomposition. And I haven't looked at these, so it'll be a surprise for both of us. Hang on. Was a perfect example of something exhibiting net primary productivity. Those tulips are growing with the help of sunlight, and they're sitting in a pot, so they have some soil and some nutrients. But they're not a system. They are just a bunch of tulips, because there was no, you see, there's no herbivores, there's no insects, there's nothing eating those tulips and then replacing nutrients back to the soil. It's just a bunch of tulips growing, and then somebody's probably going to come along and throw them out. So that's not much of an ecosystem. It does illustrate, though, how well plants can grow. Now, I'm not sure what this one is. This must be the opposite. This is the decomposition, I believe. If that was sitting on a dish of soil, that would be a bit more like a system, because as disgusting as it looks, the decomposition process is carried out by fungal organisms and bacteria that just add good compounds and nutrients back to the soil, and something else would grow from that. However, how do I get back to where I was? Escape, thank you. No. No. Oh, I'm technically challenged. Here we are. All right, I think we've belabored this enough, though. NEP, net ecosystem productivity, is the net primary productivity minus all the ecosystem respiration, meaning all the feeding and the respiration. So it's what, in a sense, it's what is left over for you to harvest. This is what can be left over in a forest system that you can still harvest and take out and still have the system continue to be stable. There is, of course, a point at which you cannot go beyond, but the fact that the net ecosystem productivity is generally a positive thing, meaning there's generally stuff left over, is the reason why we can hunt animals, harvest plant biomass, and still have the system continue. At least that's true of a natural system. In an agricultural system, what we're after is the net ecosystem productivity for ourselves as food. But we tend not to have stable, sustainable systems. We have systems that we must refeed every year. As we're generating NEP in an agricultural system, we have to add the seeds, we have to add fertilizer, we have to add pesticides, we have to add water in some cases. The only thing we don't have to add is sunlight. And then we harvest a great deal of what comes out the other end and have to start it all over again in the next season. An industrial agricultural system is very much an open system that has got a very low sustainability because there's too many inputs. to get the ecosystem productivity. A natural ecosystem tends to be one with a minimum of inputs, can generate productivity for harvesting and still continue. All right, so NPP is such an important thing to the sustainability of the whole planet that people have spent a significant amount of time trying to work out just exactly how much there is. And this has got easier and easier over time because our ability to track vegetation patterns via satellite has improved dramatically. So we can now attach numbers to the actual level of primary productivity at a number of different ecosystems along the way. I think the technology is far less sophisticated for the ocean because, of course, they can get satellite imagery of algal production in the ocean, but it only pertains to the top surface levels, and they can't see what happens further down. And there is sunlight penetrating to a good 50 feet or more, so you actually do get primary productivity in a great deal of the ocean. Nevertheless, this figure shows you how much biomass there is for us all to live on in the various different ecosystems. And when I say for us all to live on, I mean the whole biosphere. And it ranges from desert and semi-desert shrub there at the lowest, and the y-axis here is in units of grams of carbon per meter squared per year. I'll give you that figure in different units in a minute. And then the open ocean appears to be about as low in productivity as a desert, but because there is so much open ocean, the ocean is actually responsible for the bulk, or at least 50% of the primary productivity in the world. And then the systems get gradually more and more productive as you go up from there to tundra and alpine, lake and stream, the continental shelf, which is the most concentrated productive area for all countries. The continental shelf is the place where the best fisheries typically are. And then it goes up all the way to the most productive system on the planet, the tropical rainforests. Amazing places for recycling of matter and abundant energy and abundant water. So things are really cooking in the tropical areas. And only after that comes the algal beds and reefs. The aquatic systems are just as productive in the near shore as are the tropical areas. You'll notice here cultivated land is in the middle. This, of course, is the biomass that we tend to live off of. You would think, well, with all our high-tech stuff and our pesticides and our fertilizer and our irrigation, that we should be able to push the productivity of the cultivated land up to the really high natural levels. Well, we don't. We could, but we generally don't, because when we're growing cultivated crops, we're growing one species or at a time, or maybe sometimes two. But the tropical natural ecosystems and other ecosystems are polycultures. They're growing many, many, many different plants at the same time, each one of which prefers different conditions and has roots that reach to different places in the soil. You put them all together, you've got one great big efficient system. If you just try to grow one plant, you can't get anywhere near as productive as you would in a natural system where everybody's dividing up the resources. I digress. Net primary productivity across the globe shows you the same thing. Basically, pink is the lowest levels of production, and they tend to be out in the open ocean where the nutrients are limiting. But it doesn't mean there's no production out there. There's a lot of it in terms of area. And it increases from blue to green to yellow to orange and all the way up to the red, where the tropical forest systems are the most intensely productive lands on the planet, as long as they're intact. And again, they have this as grams per of carbon fixed per meter squared per year. But I can also tell you from a talk I gave last week about the net primary productivity of the globe. And that is something that does seem to be more or less constant. It's a steady state system. We have X amount of sunlight coming in. We have a certain amount of water on this planet. We have a certain temperature. So the amount of plants that we can grow on this planet to support everybody and all species is more or less fixed. And that number in terms not of grams of carbon per meter squared per year, but in grams, actually petagrams, which is 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year, is 53.6. Write that down. 53.6 plus or minus 1. That's terrestrial. We figure it's another 50-ish in the open oceans. That is how much net primary productivity we all have to live on. Now, I'll ask you the next question. How much do humans use? Let's just talk about the terrestrial portion, because they can't estimate the ocean as well. How much of the 53.6 do you think humans use? Take a guess. Anyone want to take a guess? Oh, back there, how much? Did you say 30%? Very close. Were you trying to exaggerate, or you're just guessing? Anyway, numerous people have tried to calculate that number, and they keep improving their calculations. I think they started doing it in 1986, but as satellite imagery gets better, the more we know. The number is actually considered to be around 20. So 20 of 53.6, and it's actually thought to have big margins. So it could be anywhere between 30 and 55% of what there is for every species to live on is taken up by what we call human appropriated natural net primary productivity. And it's not just what we eat. It's what we harvest for fuel and what we harvest for structure for building materials and what we appropriate to turn into urban landscape. So we're using up 40%, 40% is actually the number, of what the planet has to offer, which is a scary thought, given that if we double our population, we'll be into the 80% zone. And that does not sound safe to me. But that's the subject of a lecture I gave last week, and I can't get it out of my head. All right, so the factors affecting net ecosystem productivity and net primary productivity as well are, of course, nutrients. What are nutrients? Somebody give me quick an example of a nutrient. Who am I going to pick on? You again. You're right there. No, actual like chemical nutrients. So what's in fertilizer? It's either nitrate, ammonium, phosphate, and so those are the big ones. But there's also calcium, magnesium, potassium. There's all the things that life needs, right? You guys have all taken, it seems, a fair amount of biochemistry. So inside the cells, you need the phosphorus for the DNA. You need the nitrogen for all the nucleic acid bases. You need all kinds of salt. You need all kinds of organic matter. But so you need more than carbon, right? So the sunlight's providing the ability for the plants to fix carbon. But they need all these accessory elements to make a cell and an organism complete. And those nutrients come from the rocks or from the atmosphere. And that is why at the beginning I said you can't separate the lithosphere from the biosphere, because the biosphere needs the rocks to just get their simple nutrients from, depending on what they are. So they recognize macronutrients as being the big two, the nitrogen sources, nitrate, nitrite, or ammonia, and phosphorus, because next to carbon, those are the things we have most of in our cells. And if you don't have enough of one of those two things, you can't grow at all. So we call those things the limiting nutrients. And it's a general truism that nitrogen, not nitrogen in the atmosphere, but nitrogen in its fixed form, as in nitrate, nitrite, or ammonia, is the thing that limits productivity in marine systems. So out there in the ocean, what we really need is nitrogen. But back home, we're standing in the middle of a terrestrial system. In freshwater systems in the continent, on this continent and all other terrestrial land masses, it tends to be phosphorus that's limiting in our lakes. Does anyone recognize this picture here? It's hard asking a class of 500 questions because you're all so far away. I'll tell you what this is. This is a classic picture of what we call the experimental lakes area. You may have heard that term because it's a big biological research station that's situated in northern Ontario. It's kind of run out of the Freshwater Institute in Manitoba. It's a place that's used to study the processes in freshwater ecosystems. It's a big Canadian institution, and recently the federal government decided to hack all the funding from it. We're not exactly sure why, except they don't like any sort of environmental science research. And so the state of this place is a little bit uncertain. Professor Mitchell will tell you about some interesting experiments that they're doing with respect to mercury cycling when he comes back. But this is what we call an iconic photograph. This is a absolutely pure, lovely, clean lake area up in northern Ontario, which back in the 70s and the 80s they decided to use as a big experiment to prove that phosphorus can limit algal growth. So they took this connected lake and they put a great big curtain between one end and the other. I think big plastic thing, so literally there was no water exchange between one side and the other. And they dumped a whole bunch. Actually, they didn't have to dump a lot. They put a little bit of extra phosphorus, so a little bit of phosphorus fertilizer in this part of the lake, and they left this untouched. And in the course of one summer, of course, this half of the lake turned from a crystal clear blue, see through the water place to this scuzzy, algal-filled basin because the algae went nuts. They had all this fertilizer. And that, of course, is the basis of the pollution that causes too much algal growth in our urban areas. But they nailed this process and proved that it was true, that phosphorus is the limiting factor by carrying out this experiment up there. Oh, I have to guess what that's a picture of. Does anyone know? What? Is it? Oh. Yeah, you're right, right? Is that Newfoundland up there? And this is PEI? Or is this a part of it? Anyway, wherever it is in the world, it's what it shows here is you can see increased algal growth in the coastal zones. That again is increased algal growth, but it's the marine system, and here it's the nitrate that's actually causing the increase in the algal growth, not so much the phosphorus. And actually they found in the tropical areas it's not just nitrogen that's lacking, it's iron. So you can see big plumes of algal growth coming off of the Galapagos because it's fertilized with iron there. Factors affecting NEP. So there's nitrogen, there's oxygen. You have to have oxygen for the plants and all the associated organisms that grow on them to breathe with, although there are many exceptions in the bacterial world, but we won't talk about that. And we are going to talk about that, I'm sorry. There is a whole bunch of organisms, largely decomposer organisms, that when the oxygen is gone, they can use other things to breathe with. They can use nitrate, for example, as a substitute for oxygen, so they can get energy out of their food. And then there's other things. There's nitrate, there's sulfate, there's even carbon dioxide itself. And they form the basis of our anaerobic metabolism that takes place in low oxygen areas such as mud ponds and marshes and swamps and a lot of the coastal zones now that have been over-fertilized. Oh, ecosystem services. Boy, I wonder if we're even going to get to the cycles. Ecosystem services is something we should just have a whole lecture on itself because it's one of those things that is absolutely critical for us to understand. Not only do we get biomass out of a healthy ecosystem, but we get a bunch of processes that contribute just to a healthy environment as well. And those things collectively we refer to as ecosystem services. And many people are involved in trying to put a dollar figure on how much these ecosystem services cost. So just to give you an idea of what kind of processes we're talking about, let me read some of those. Up at the top, here. Regulate climate. Obviously, our photosynthetic organisms are taking up carbon dioxide and producing oxygen, and that is good for the temperature balance as well as the breathability of the air. Provide timber and other resources, a clear ecosystem service. Recycle nutrients, another clear ecosystem service. If it weren't for happy, functioning decomposer communities and soils and fungi, the world will be littered for a time with dead bodies. You know, they've got to go somewhere, they have to go back in the soil. We need healthy microbes in order to carry out those functions. Provide food, of course, the crops and the stuff we fish out of the ocean. Filter runoff and treat waste. That is indicated here in a wetland system, but that is so true. Our wastewater is chock full of what is really nutrients for other ecosystems. And if they can be adequately filtered slowly, as they always have been through things such as wetland, we can effectively recycle that waste and turn it back into biomass. Pollination of plants, that's something that's been in the news a lot. Of course, we need insects, which are products of a healthy ecosystem, to be able to go around and just transfer pollen between flowers, which is important for so much of our agriculture. Habitat, control erosion. Every time you hear a story about a major landslide, you'll know there's deforestation behind that issue. And there's purify water and air of all kinds of pollutants, even the pesticides that we put on the ground and the ones that end up in the atmosphere. A great deal of them can be broken down by healthy, again, decomposer populations. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that because I'm running out of time. All right, so just a few words about the major cycles. Biogeochemical cycles. Earth is a closed system. Now, as I said, it's a continuum. Earth is not so closed that it doesn't have inputs. We constantly have sunlight coming in, thank God. But generally we don't lose stuff from the atmosphere, although we do lose some hydrogen and some helium. Every time somebody puts up a helium balloon, it's gone, it escapes from the atmosphere. But in general, our gravity hangs on to our atmosphere, and most everything that's started off on the planet remains there. And it is the job of all the ecosystems to keep it functioning, producing production, feeding all the different organisms, and letting evolution carry on. So it's open to energy, but it's generally closed to matter. And everything has to be recycled. Matter travels through the many spheres of Earth continuously. This is, as I said before, it has to go, nothing exists just in the atmosphere or just in the lithosphere or just in the biosphere. Things trade between those sections all the time. From a biogeochemical cycle standpoint, by matter, we are usually referring to elements, or we talk about our major cycles in terms of the elements they recycle. So that is carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, the big three right there for biomass production, sulfur to some extent, and iron. And the degree to which they are well worked out really just emphasizes how much importance we place on them. Matter circulates between pools or reservoirs. The volume of matter moving among reservoirs per unit time is called a flux. So that is how much of a certain element changes its form over time. So all those numbers I gave you for net primary productivity, that is a flux of carbon from the atmosphere into the biosphere, because it was in grams of carbon per meter squared per year or in petagrams per year. Fluxes are not necessarily stable. In other words, the classic example, we have changed the flux of carbon to the atmosphere, but that's an anthropogenic effect and not generally a change you'd see in a natural ecosystem. Residence time is the amount of time a molecule or atom stays in a pool. So if you have like 1,000,000-year residence time for, say, silicon in rocks, it means it stays there for a long, long time. And there are sources of compounds and sinks of compounds, but of course, if you're looking at the Earth as a whole, it's both a source and a sink. And lots of feedbacks, hopefully negative. So you have a source of material that moves at a certain rate, flux, here we are, this thing here, into a reservoir, and it stays there for a given amount of time until another process moves it into a sink. And this diagram I'm not happy with because it's a one-way diagram, and natural ecosystems generally don't do this. They have sources, reservoirs, sinks, which are really just other reservoirs, and then generally things cycle around. All biogeochemical cycles are circles. All right. So, of course, the one that people are most concerned about these days is the carbon cycle, and as Professor Mitchell said here, much more extensive coverage of this in a few weeks. But the carbon cycle, these things are incredibly simplistic. It doesn't, I mean, they're incredibly important, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand the actual fluxes themselves and why they occur, because the processes aren't complex. They're important, but they're not complex. So if we look at the carbon cycle, we basically have a pool of it, a reservoir of carbon as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there's a number actually given here. I don't know what these units are. Oh, these are in petagrams, 10 to the 15th grams. So there's 821 thereabouts in the atmosphere at any one time. And there's a terrible missing arrow here. Sorry, I'm looking at this diagram and asking myself, where on earth is the photosynthesis? We got volcanic action adding to the CO2. We have ocean-atmosphere exchange. That is photosynthesis in the ocean. That's right. And then you get, once biomass is formed in the ocean, some of it drops down to the sediments in the bottom, and then some of it becomes buried forever. Or not forever, but may come back in a geological time. Then we have fossil fuel combustion. So when we're burning things, and when there is forest burning, that adds to the CO2. We have reduced uptake by plants. But I don't see the arrow showing what the actual photosynthetic uptake rate is. That's odd. I'm going to lodge a complaint. There should be a great big arrow that shows 50 petagrams of carbon coming down from the atmosphere into the terrestrial and the ocean zones. And then basically, the decomposition and the combustion processes put it back again. So it's really just one simple cycle. Photosynthesis, respiration, and combustion, and it cycles through the atmosphere in a long, slow cycle. The only place where that differs is the ocean burial and anything coming back up from volcanic vents, which are also, the reservoirs have been sitting there for a long time. And of course the fossil fuels that are formed from ocean burials and other terrestrial burials that come up after a long time. But in general, photosynthesis, respiration, and combustion should balance each other so that CO2 is always the same. As you are probably well aware, our increased fossil fuel combustion is thought to be increasing CO2 beyond a level that is considered safe in the atmosphere. Why does it matter? Who cares if we have more CO2 than we normally would in the past? 3 reasons. One is the heat effect, so therefore the global warming. The second big reason is the ocean acidification. As CO2 increases in the atmosphere, when it dissolves in the ocean, it decreases pH. And that, for lack of more complex terminology, dissolves many marine creatures that have calcium and calcite shells. So it's a rapid change that's making it difficult for some organisms to survive, and that pH change also makes it changes the net primary productivity of the algae. There is some hope that the excess CO2 in the atmosphere might be balanced by net primary productivity. It is a fertilizer effect for some plants, and I don't think people have measured that sufficiently to know whether the planet can actually, or the plant life, the autotrophs on this planet can actually balance that extra carbon. But I'm sure Carl's going to get into this. Nitrogen, next big important nutrient out there after carbon. It is all around us all the time. It makes up about 78% of the atmosphere. It's what we breathe, but we don't do anything with it. Nitrogen, in its gaseous form as N2, is just an inert gas. It does nothing. Sixth most abundant element on Earth, key ingredient in proteins and DNA, essential for plant growth, quite scarce. Right, nitrogen fixation is one of the things that's revolutionized agriculture. Nitrogen fixation refers to taking N2 from its inert gaseous form and reducing it and turning it into NH3 or ammonia, or NH4, the ammonium ion. And you can do that two ways. Well, more than two, but basically there's a biological way to do it, and there's a synthetic way to do it. And there are huge numbers of organisms on this planet that can take nitrogen out of the atmosphere, turn it into ammonia. They are always bacteria, but they will do so in partnership with plants. So generally the members of the bean family, the peas, all the legumes, they generally all have bacterial partners in their root systems that will take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turn it into ammonia and basically make fertilizer out of it, allowing them to grow, allowing the plants to grow. And so they form an extremely important part of older agriculture and still newer agriculture. People would often grow a grain crop together with a legume crop. They do this all around the world because the legumes bring the nitrogen naturally into the system. On top of that, there's a whole bunch of algae in the marine system and the freshwater systems that can do the same thing. The cyanobacteria, not all of them, but some of them will do that same process. They'll take nitrogen right out of the atmosphere, they'll turn it into ammonia, and they'll fertilize themselves and the stuff around them. That naturally occurring nitrogen fixation is a fundamental process for all the natural ecosystems. Of course, humans ask them, oh sorry, I'm skipping out one other thing. There is the lightning. When lightning strikes, it will naturally reduce some nitrogen as well. But it's minor compared to the biological one. And of course, people, in their desire for changing the world, came up with a process to fix nitrogen synthetically. And it's the process, let me go forward. No, I'll go back to that. I'll just go on about nitrogen fixation for a little bit. There was a guy called Haber-Bosch who won a Nobel Prize way back in the earlier part of the last century for coming up with a process for converting nitrogen to ammonia. And he did so using really high temperatures and really high pressures and a whole bunch of energy. And he forced the reduction of nitrogen into ammonia. Unfortunately, he did so for the processes of generating lethal gases for the war effort in World War I and II, I think. But the side effect was, having learned how to make ammonia to kill people with, he ended up producing ammonia that we could use to fertilize crops. And that fundamental part of fertilizers, our ability to do that without biological organisms, dramatically increased the amount of fertilizer in the world and fueled what became the green revolution. So nitrogen fixation, a major planet-changing process. These days we kind of have too much. We're over-fertilizing our coastal zones, but that's a different story. Nitrification. The ammonia that gets made by plants and their associated bacterial partners, the partners of the plants, in the soils naturally gets turned into nitrite, and it gets oxidized, and then to nitrate by a bunch of bacteria that are actually using these things as energy sources or electron acceptors. A healthy soil will do this nitrification process all the time, and it affects plant nutrients because plants love this stuff as much as they love this. But unfortunately, there's a balancing process called denitrification, also done by bacteria, where the nitrate in the soil gets turned back to N2. So there's a circle there, N2 fixed by bacteria or humans to ammonia, ammonia to nitrite, nitrate, nitrate back to N2. Perfect circle, keeps the nitrogen in balance unless something throws it off. So basically there's a cycle, and I won't go into the details here, but do remember these things are supposed to be cycles. There are processes that balance the reduction to ammonia and its oxidation back to N2. 1050. Oh, human alteration of N cycle. I've already mentioned this, but as I said, Haber-Bosch is the name of the guy who came up with the process. We have doubled nitrogen fixation on this planet, and maybe more than that. There's an increased production of all agricultural crops, but there's also an increase in particular when soybeans. Soybeans are like one of the major #1 crops in the USA and around the world. They tend to be legumes, so they can fix nitrogen themselves. Ironically, though, we fertilize our soybeans and kind of stop them from doing their own fixation. But that's another story. Increased atmospheric N2O, greenhouse gas, and other NOx, so random oxides of nitrogen. There's a number of things that happen because of this. We produce a lot of nitrous oxides come off of the soils that have been heavily fertilized, but they also come out of the back of our cars. As the internal combustion engine is burning fuel and driving us forward, it tends to oxidize the nitrate gas, and not the nitrate, nitrogen gas, the N2 gas in the atmosphere, gets burned at high temperatures, and we get these N2O gases and NOx coming out of the back of the vehicles. They cause air pollution problems, and the N2O is another greenhouse gas that increases heat absorption in our atmosphere. There is also the little problem of acid rain. Does he mention that? No. When NO3 in the atmosphere is dissolved by rain, it produces nitric acid, and that contributes to the acidification of soils and lakes. And actually going along with that, the more acid the rain is that comes down, the more other nutrients such as calcium and potassium gets flushed out of soils. Acid rain. Sorry, I'm going in an opposite order. Anyone here not familiar with acid rain? Oh, good. I'll tell you. Long story short, sulfur oxides in the atmosphere from burning fuels and coal, and the nitrous oxides from traffic, both of those dissolve in the rain and give you a lower pH than normal rain. And it brings the acidity level of natural lakes and soils down when there is low buffer capacity. There tends to be low buffer capacity all around the Canadian Shield where it's rock country and not limestone country. And just as a point of history, they discovered acid rain right here. Not here, Scarborough, but University of Toronto. I think it was one of the graduate students of a zoology professor called Harold Harvey. One of his technicians or grad students was up north sampling fish because that was their area of research, and he just happened to stick a pH meter in the lake. And went, oh my God, it's pH 4. It's like, it's not supposed to be pH 4. They're supposed to be pH 5.6 or 6 or 7, depending on the geology. But that gave birth to the whole field. And it happened here at University of Toronto. It's just as simple as someone measuring something they hadn't have thought of measuring before. Anyway, the whole acid rain thing drove a whole bunch of pollution controls, which hopefully are doing better. Eutrophication, as I alluded to just a little bit earlier, we are fixing and using so much nitrogen fertilizer that we over-fertilize the soils. It runs into lakes, it runs into rivers, it runs into our coastal zones, and it leads to abundant algal growth, and then abundant algal death, and then decomposition, and then loss of oxygen. That is the cause of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Increased plant growth and carbon storage. We'll leave this as a big unknown. There is I think actually there's a lot of hope that plants may grow far better than they used to. I'm going to let Professor Mitchell do the eutrophication part. I just told you in a couple of quick words what it is. Just promise me you won't make the mistake of saying, people often refer to eutrophication as the fertilization of algae by fertilizer, its abundant growth, and that the algae themselves suck the oxygen out of the water. This is not true. The algae don't suck the oxygen out of the water, they produce it. But when they die, the bacteria that break them down take the water out of the oxygen. So it's a two-phase process, growth followed by decline. The decline takes oxygen out of the water and leads to massive fish kills. And I'm going to leave the mercury part. Oh, see, there's the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. Yeah, I'll let Professor Mitchell talk to you about this because it's interesting. And I'll let him cover phosphorus, and I'll let him cover mercury, which is totally his own specialty. So thank you all for coming.